Hello and welcome, I am Calcoa. Today I am going to go over a way to tell when a player is hovering over a UI element, and some common things that us, as game developers, may want to, well, develop. Okay, so let's get it done. I will briefly go over the game scene objects. This scene has a canvas for the UI elements, and an empty game object that has a script added as its only component, named Game Manager. Note that I added a tag to the Game Manager object, Game Controller. The canvas has 3 empty game objects, one for Button Panel, another for Inventory Panel, and another for a Stat Panel. The Button Panel has just a few things: a UI image for background, a UI button for Inventory, a UI button for Stats, and an empty game object that houses UI objects for Description. This description area just has a UI image for background, and a UI text element that we will change when we hover over certain things in our UI. Note that the description area empty game object is unchecked so that it is inactive. The same thing is done for the other panels, Inventory, and Stats. We will activate these either through our code or through our UI setup. Okay, so now with our Inventory button selected, click on the Add component in Inspector. Type out the word event, then select Event Trigger from the options. From here click the button Add New Event Type, and select the option for Pointer Enter. Click the Add a New Event button again and select Pointer Exit this time. These events trigger when the mouse enters, meaning that the player's cursor is over our Inventory button, and when it exits it is just how it sounds, that is when the cursor leaves the active button area. Before we start setting up the event triggers and the rest of the on-click events for the button, let's do the same for the Stats button. Great! We are ready to now add some code for our Game Manager script. First, let's delete some of this default code. Next, let's add a using line for Unity Engine.UI. This is only needed so we can alter the description text. Feel free to skip that part if not changing or referencing UI objects in your own project. Let's create the following variables. A public bool is over UI. A public bool panel's active. A serialize field so we can access an inspector, make a private game object, description text. Another like the last, this time a private text UI description. In the update function, we will add example code later, showing how simply modifying the is over UI bool, we can pass this along to such things as preventing input checks or whatevs. Let's create the following functions. A public void over UI. A public void is not over UI. In the over UI function, let's set the bool is over UI so it has a value of true. In the is not over UI function, let's set the bool again, but this time to a value of false. Now let's add another function, public void toggle panels, which will help alleviate a certain bug later. Let's set our bool of panels active to equal not panels active. This makes a true value of false and vice versa. Next add the lines to check. If not panels active, then set our is over UI bool to false. We do this because in Unity there is a small bug that can happen when we close a panel, and we set up an event trigger on the close button, on pointer exit does not trigger, so we are explicitly setting what we will set the button event trigger to do, in this small snippet of code. Let's create a reference as an example, make a public player movement controller, or whatever script name you are using that takes player input, and name it accordingly. Now in the update function, let's write some logic based on if player mouses over a UI element that we will add event triggers on. Do a check, if is over UI, then check if our player movement controller script is not null, then we set a bool in our other script for player inputs, so it act on it, or lack of acting. Then make an else statement, copy and paste the logic from above, then set the other bool to false. Oof, that's supposed to be a bool, not a function. Alternatively, you could do a check if controller script is not null, then the other bool is equal to our is over UI bool value for simpler code. Before I forget, let's add a function, public void update description text. Let's make this function take in a string, make it something like UI text. Let's do a check, if our text reference is not null, then set our text value equal to our string passed in from our UI text string. Alright! That should do it for our game manager script changes. Back in Unity Editor, let's select Inventory button. In the inspector, click the plus sign to add an event trigger to the pointer enter block. Let's do this 2 more times, this way we have a total of 3 triggers. Select the first trigger and drag the Game Manager object into the blank object slot. Now where it says no function, click the drop-down, hover over Game Manager script, then select the over UI function we created earlier. In the second trigger block, drag the description panel into the blank slot, then click drop-down, and hover Game Object from menu, then select Set Active Bool. If the checkbox is unchecked, then check it. This is because when hovering over the button, we are changing the description text, as an example. Now for the third trigger, again drag the Game Manager object into the blank slot, click drop-down, hover over Game Manager, and then select Update Description Text function. In the blank area under this script, we pass in a string we called UI text, and this will set our description, so let's put in something like View Inventory. The exit triggers are similar, except I am not going to worry about what the text is set to in my example, but if you plan to keep the description UI open when not hovering over something, then feel free to change the description just as we did for the pointer enter trigger. Let's click the plus icon in the pointer exit block, and again, making it have 2 event triggers. Now drag Game Manager object into the first blank slot, and click drop down, then hover Game Manager, and select the function, not over UI instead. Next drag the description area panel into the second blank slot, and click drop down, then hover Game Object, and make sure the box is unchecked this time. Now if you play the game, you should see that when player hovers over the Inventory button, the description text appears and says, View Inventory, and also when player moves mouse away from the button, the description disappears. Now let's add the same functionality to the Stats button, with the only differences being, we change the description to something like, View Stats. Now let's add function to the buttons on click events. With Inventory buttons selected, in the inspector, click the plus sign to add an on click event found near bottom of the button block. Let's do this 2 more times, this way we have a total of 3 events. Select the first event and drag the Inventory panel UI object into the blank object slot. Then click drop down and hover Game Object from menu, then select Set Active Bool. If the checkbox is unchecked, then check it. Now for the second event, drag the button panel UI object into the blank slot, click drop down, and hover Game Object from menu, then select Set Active Bool, this time making sure the box is unchecked. We want to close the button panel and reveal the Inventory panel. Now for the third event, drag the Game Manager object into the blank slot, click drop down, hover over Game Manager, and then select Toggle Panels function. In our inventory panel, I created a back button, essentially with on-click events that reverse the on-click of the inventory button, most notably is panel closing, button panel revealed, and a toggle panel event from the Game Manager script. This has also been done to our stats panel, difference being it closes the stats panel instead of the inventory panel. Let's time warp and pretend we did the same process for on-click events for the stats button that was done for inventory button, except the appropriate panel for stats is revealed instead of inventory. Now if we play the game, we can see the on-click events for the UI panels and buttons. Next, I will briefly go over the player movement controller script, at least where the event triggers of being over the UI elements are concerned. Please don't get overwhelmed by my Calcoa code. In this player movement controller script, we are just going to add a couple things to show as an example how our previous shenanigans may be applied. First, let's add two variables. One to reference our Game Manager script. Let's serialize field, private Game Manager, and name it lowercase Game Manager. And the other we needed to add already, a public bool over UI. In the update function, add a check, if Game Manager is equal to null, then check, if GameObject.findGameObject with tag is GameController is not equal to null, then assign Game Manager is equal to, copy and add this bit down here, and add .getComponent of Game Manager. Please recall we added the tag in Unity to our Game Manager object. Then add an else statement, where we assign the Game Manager script to have a player movement controller script equal to this, meaning the current script. Next we will go over a couple examples how that can affect player movement. In place of where you check inputs, whether in update, fixed update, or in our case, the movement function, we can check if over UI and do things, or prevent inputs, or more. So in our update function, expand the check for network ownership, and if not dead check is passed, call movement function, and here in the movement function, we check for inputs, and in this example those are just pressing spacebar to initiate a roll for increased speed, and animation state changes. The first example, and the simplest, is we check first, if not over UI, then check inputs. This should prevent player inputs as far as player movement or actions go. Another example, slightly more complex, but accounts for situations where you want a button release to be checked. We are doing the following. In our example, we also want to check if the jump button is released either when over UI element or when a panel is active. Let's add a couple else statements. First, add an else for when we check, if not Game Manager panels active, then call check button up function, and the other else is where we check if Game Manager is not equal to null, then check if Game Manager panels active, then check button up function is called. Note the first else is when Game Manager panels active is already true. So the second else we need to check if the Game Manager panels active is true. If this is clear as mud, I apologize. Please use your own methods as these are merely examples and in no way should be treated as anything else. Anyways, if we now play the game, we can see the player inputs being halted when hovering our rudimentary UI, and when a panel is active. Yes, we can see that when player released the spacebar, the roll is concluded as intended. That is all for this video. Until next time. Have fun!